right, there's no such thing as bad whiskey. Some whiskeys are just better than others.
Welcome to podcast 1 for the Whiskey Compadres. We're sitting with Jason at the beautiful State Street Eating House.
I can tell you as a patron of this place, I've been very impressed not only with your amount of alcohol in your great bar that you have here, but you also have great food. So tell us a little bit about the experience at the State Street Eating House and what you guys have done with your whiskey collection over the last several years.
So we've been around for about 8 years now, and we've always been progressive, the bar program, our food program, wine program. But in the past couple of years, we've transitioned really into the brown spirits, more particularly whiskeys in general. And part of the podcast we're going to be talking about with the Resurgence of Rye also leads just to the broader view that whiskey now is taking the forefront for a lot of our patrons. And for us particularly, we have over 100 whiskeys now. Japanese, Scotch whiskeys, your classic bourbon, American rye, etc. A little bit of a palate for everybody. And not just that, it's not just the bottles that we have on the shelves, but it's also what our bartenders can do with it. Each of our bartenders, we always joke, can kind of give a dissertation on alcohol in general, and each have their specialities. I've got a couple that really like working with the Amaris, the bitter notes, and blending them with the sweet notes of a bourbon, etc. Others that will give more proofy style cocktails. And it really has developed into a playground for their bartenders to where they can create, and the guest experience is no longer on the guest to know the product. We don't even carry a menu with our list of over 100 whiskeys because we don't want people to sit down and go to their comfort zone. We want them to sit down and interact with our bartenders. We want them to have a little bit of knowledge would be nice, but the feeling of the unknown, so that they can experiment. So they can sit here and go, wow, that is overwhelming. You have 100 whiskeys right there. Hey, bartender, tell me what you got. And because they have the knowledge behind that bar, they're able to guide you into something you might not have ever experienced before. And we really take pride in that and turn it into a great experience for our guests.
Oh, that's absolutely fantastic.
So with the resurgence of Ryes, we know that they've played such a crucial role in the U.S. dating back to 1798, founded in Mount Vernon Distillery, all the mash bills.
Yeah, and a lot of the mash bills came in Pennsylvania and the Northeast and Maryland between the 17 and 1800s, and then we had Prohibition, which almost completely destroyed rye. In fact, we got all the way to the 1980s, and not a lot of companies were dealing in rye. There was only a handful. Then 2001, 2002, we started seeing a lot pick up in it, and now it's just been a huge resurgence. Even though it's not a huge part of the market, it's been a very important part of the market. And we're here to get some of your insights on what you think some of the resurgence is due to.
Well, I think before we got on this podcast, we had a conversation, kind of the evolution of alcohol, in with the guests. You think about early 2000s, that was the martini craze, right? So think Cosmos, think 10-ounce pours in a glass as large as you can with ice crystals on top. And then that kind of transitioned, about 10, 15 years ago. I actually had an interview with another organization, and we were talking about the resurgence of whiskey in general, right? Brown spirits. And at that time, that was Scotch taking the forefront. Well, that's a very aggressive palate. If you think about it, that's that peat, that's that smoke. All right. And so you're talking two extremes from going to that vodka base to that strong peat note. And that, I guess we'd say, indicative of the extremes that it went to, of people willing to try something new. And that opened the door, in my professional opinion, of people say, you know what? That note's kind of different. That's that extreme, right? Let me see where else I got to it. And another perspective on it is that peat note, that very, very strong note, is very easy for guests to perceive, all right? That taste, right? So they would try it and go, oh, I know that. That's an Isla, because that's really strong and peaty, all right? And they could pick that note, and all of a sudden they're going, you know what? I like this, right? And that's kind of evolved into the progression of brown spirits. And now once they're used to those big easy notes, i.e. peat, they're able to come back into the more subtle style, right? The sweet notes, right? The pepper, the spice. Well, wait a minute, how's that translating into your brown spirits? Well, guess what? Guess where you go into that American? Well, wait, we got it in the United States. We got a great portfolio and producers and distillers, and the explosion of not micro distillers, but non-Kentucky based distillers. And all of a sudden, these guests who were only used to those large notes like the peat and the Scotch and those darks that are very approachable, their palates have been refined. And now all of a sudden, they're like, you know what? I want to go with that rye. Why? Because it's giving an expression of a note that they might not have had in the spice, in the cardamoms, right? You get into those kind of subtle things there, and they're a little bit more confident with it. And they can be a little bit proofy, and we'll go dive in a little bit more, I'm sure, as far as the range of rye. But whiskey in general has gone from that explosion of, I gotta know what's in the bottle, to now it's getting more refined, which is ryes, bourbons, and American generals.
So Jason, I have a couple thoughts on that, but first, can you introduce who we have?
Yeah. So right behind our bar, we have Miss Ember. So we kind of noted that every bartender has their speciality. One thing we love about Miss Ember is her knowledge in rye, which is appropriate for this podcast.
So Ember, I contribute some of this resurgence to you guys bringing this back into your basics, your fundamentals, your old fashions, your Manhattans, and correct me if I'm wrong, but these ryes soften the notes of those drinks, right? They bring down the bitterness.
They really do. One of the big things that I've noticed is bourbon can become watered down so easily in a Manhattan and old fashioned. It just doesn't hold up to the flavor. And for people who are really becoming accustomed to those tones, they're looking to catch those nuances. And so if you're going to pair with an amaro or a bitter, you want those things to complement each other rather than overpower or outshine. Like Victor's Rye is one of my personal favorites for that, because it really can maintain, and that even in the high overproofs, like the barrel strength rye we have right now is a 112.2, and it still has a nice finish. So when you're putting that over a rock, it can withstand that little bit of water. You can have a conversation, and you don't have to just have that overpowering in the front and then the mellow in the end.
Yeah, and that's what I really, really loved about rye is the high proof. It can withstand the ice. You can still taste the drink, and it doesn't give such an overpowering flavor on the back palate. It's very smooth.
Yeah. So you gave us your favorite, Jason. What's the favorite of yours up there?
She and I have very similar tastes. I mean, she put me on that Michter's barrel strength rye with a proper cocktail, and it shows a lot. We have a great relationship with Redwood Empire as well. Mm-hmm. They have what I consider one of the better blended styles in what they call the Lost Monarch. It's a 50% bourbon, 50% rye mash bill, and it's not the mash bill itself. Those are actually two separate bills that are put together there in a blend, and that's a nice sipper too. So I'd have to go with Michter's rye and coming down into that Redwood Empire, a little bit of rye in there, a little bit of bourbon touch, pretty sweet.
Yeah, I'm a huge Michter's fan, but one of my go-tos that I always have in my bar is I'm a big Whistle Pig guy. I love Whistle Pig 10.
Yeah, we got that right.
Yeah, I love Whistle Pig 10. It makes a good drink.
Boss Hog.
Yeah, the Boss Hog, the Whistle Pig 10. That has been the little distillery that kind of could. They're a very awarded distillery nationwide, and that's one of my go-tos. I also am a big fan of Redwood Empire too.
Yeah.
Coming into the resurgent conversation, that comes out of California.
Mm-hmm.
So now bourbon and ryes are being produced all over the nation, which is allowing people to have a little bit more of a hands-on. Before, if you're in Oregon, you weren't going to necessarily go to Kentucky to taste something at a distillery. But now, if it's just around the corner, you're going to become more familiar with that on a local basis. It's just going to, I think that maybe created some of the interest, but also that interest then fed the momentum. There's so much momentum in this industry right now.
Accessibility? Would that be?
Yes.
Yeah, and what's good is it's the way all these distilleries that are separating themselves from Kentucky, and we've talked about Texas and a few others. Everybody is up in their game, so everybody is producing a fairly good product now, because if they don't, then they're not in business anymore, right? And so it's been a really, really exciting in the whiskey and the bourbon industry, because you're getting all these new places to try in new areas, and it's just been pretty fantastic, I think.
Well, think about the new areas. You're also getting diversity of flavor profiles.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you talk about maceration, saturation, and evaporation, right? Which is the process of your aging processes. When you do that in Oregon, California, or Texas, you're getting a different result. Right. So, when a distiller is producing a product and they go into barrel, they're going into a legal limit proof that they're allowed to. Well, how do you get those proofs crazy high? Well, it's actually the evaporation, right? It's that concentration of flavor profiles you're getting because you're taking the water out. Well, let's say you take a bourbon style or a rye style, throw that in Texas. I know you're kind of biased to that. Put that in that dry, hot, heat environment. You're going to be pulling out like 125 sometimes out of barrel. And yet, you didn't put it in that, and so you're getting a whole different profile just based on where it's aged. Oregon, California, Redwood, Indiana, which is a lot of these production is happening in Indiana. I think we talked about a story about how, if it wasn't produced in Kentucky back in the day, well, that's not bourbon. Well, very, very quickly, we're learning that's not true. As long as you got good water, good malt base or good mash build in your aging process, you can do a lot of things with it. I think we even have High West. Yeah, Utah. Look at that dry, warm climate with extremes because they get cold too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Double rye gets called for all the time.
Yeah.
It's got a little smokiness to it. I wonder if that's maybe the elevation.
Yeah, and so Ember touched on that note really well, was the diversification of flavors and the accessibility across the United States will lead to that resurgence.
Yeah, when you think about the example with the Scotch, that's in this tiny region. Now we're going across a lot larger landmass. Just pulling up little bits of flavors from the different bits of soil. I mean, the minerals in the soil across the nation are so different as well. So it's just, I think it's pretty neat.
Well, you had me as smoke notes. Anybody that knows me knows I'm a smoke junkie.
So you get a bottle of campfire hiding at home, nobody else can get it.
Exactly. We have a whole podcast coming all about smoke. Stay tuned.
Now, there's so many things that we can contribute to this conversation as far as what the resurgence is, and there's no definitive reason as to why. Something I heard actually just a day ago, I went to a whiskey tasting with a distiller, and she had a wonderful way of phrasing why she loves working with these spirits, and that is it's relationship directly to the consumer, whereas wine, and I do have a background in it, when you taste wine, it's complex, right? But it comes with a note that the guest should know something about it, right? And you have to drink it at X temperature. You have to drink it this way. Don't put your hand around the glass, that sort of thing. There's rules and how and why, and it's structured. But when it comes to a cocktail, right, especially in your whiskey categories, it's all on the guest, right? Because she might like it on a rock. I like it with a dash of water. You might like it on a cube. Let's put a little sugar and sweetness. So how you drink it, right, is almost as important as the product that's going in, right? Because you take that 120 proof product and you sip it straight. It could be hot as heck and just not enjoyable. Now, all of a sudden, stir that down into a nice old fashioned, add a Mari note to it of some sort, and you get a fantastic cocktail. All right, so that's now on the guest, that interaction with what's in the glass with little constraint.
Yeah, I mean, and it's kind of what I've always said about it. It's about personality, right? Everybody has a personality. Every drink profile has a personality. You may not like that personality, but some other people will. So it's very subjective, and that's what I like about it.
3 completely different drinks starting with the same base spirit.
It's almost like a fingerprint.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of if any.
It's fun.
Well, I think we're closing in on our first podcast. I want to thank Jason, Emmer, from Craig and myself,
and a beautiful State Street Eatery for having us here. Like I say, this is our first podcast. We're very, very happy to have you guys here. And always drink responsibly. Big thing. Always drink responsibly. And whiskey is always better with friends.
Cheers.
Thank
Cheers.
Very nice.